Okay, so maybe we can get started, Dashun. I can introduce you, and
Yeah.
I think other people will keep on joining as we move forward. So, welcome everybody. Today we are very pleased to have with us Professor Dashun Wang. Professor Wang is a professor of management and organizations at the Kellogg School of Management and the McCormick School of Engineering, Northwestern University. He is the founding director of the Center for Science and Innovation, and he's also a core faculty at the Northwestern Institute of Complex Systems. His current research focuses on science of science, a quest to turn the scientific methods and curiosities upon science itself. Uh, his work has been published in journals, one after the other. He has papers in Nature and Science, and has been featured in virtually all major global media outlets, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, The Economist, Bloomberg, and the list goes on and on. Uh, he's also won several awards. He's won the Network Science Society's Erdos Renier Award, the Thinkers 50 Radar List 2021 Award, Poets and Quants Best 40 Under 40 Professors, and I could keep on going, and people won't get to hear Dashun, and this bio will keep on going, so I'm going to stop here. I should also note that his first book has been co-authored with Albert Varabasi, and that was recently published. So congratulations for that, Dashun. So with that, I'll give the stage over to Dashun, and we're very excited to see what you have to say. Over to you,
Thank
Dashun.
you so much. Okay, I'm going to start sharing my screen, and then with my, hope you'll be able to see it.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, everybody. As everybody knows, IISc always holds a special place in my heart. So this is a very exciting opportunity for me to be back to where everything started. So, I hope one day I'll also be able to come back to State College in person and visit again and meet with all the old friends and making new friends. All right. So today I want to talk about several projects around the lines of science. And let me give you a quick intro, 1 minute intro on what science of science is about. All right. So 2018 was actually a very exciting year for the field, where we had the first review paper of the field, Science of Science in Science. Later that year, Science also put out a special issue, putting us on the cover and arguing to vote in more scientific science. And earlier mid last year, we also excited about the publication of the first book of the field, The Science of Science by Cambridge University Press. So this idea of turning scientific curiosities and methods on science itself, this is a very long-standing idea. So this traces back to at least the mid-past century. So there's a range of foundational scholars in the field, such as Robert K. Morton, the great sociologist of science, thinking about the idea of Matthew effect, singletons and multiples. The Solar Price, who's a physicist turned historian of science, thinking about the idea of power laws, cumulative advantage. Harriet Zuckerman, another sociologist of science, thinking about the idea of scientific elites and ethnographic approach to understand scientific career success. Or using Garfield, who is the founder of Science Citation Index, coming from an information science angle to think about the metrics of science. And of course, there is Thomas Kuhn, one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century, thinking about the idea of paradigm shifts. I think in many ways, this recent surge of interest on the science of sciences to stand on the shoulders of these giants, but then take two things that they did not have the luxury to have in their time. The first is an increasing availability of large-scale data sets that traces the entirety of the scientific enterprise, helping us capture its workings at a new level of scale and detail. Second is the parallel developments in fields like artificial intelligence, network science, complex systems, data science over the past decades, which offer us a wide range of tools that help us make sense of this data with growing accuracy and robustness. Together, they tell a complex yet insightful story about how innovative careers unfold, how collaborations contribute to discovery, and how scientific progress may emerge through a combination of multiple factors. And so I thought what I'm going to do today is to give you a sampler of a range of type of projects. And I selected for diversity of the flavors. So hopefully we'll give you a flavor of different kinds of projects we're doing. And in the hope, particularly the theme of this seminar is to have a call for action, is hopefully you will realize there's a great opportunity of applying AI in this domain. And that's been very promising, but it's also quite follow. And there will be a lot of opportunities to think about how to apply AI to the problems we have been thinking. All right, let me start with one major direction of the field, which is aims to understand patterns of successful careers. One example is my earlier work with led by IST PhD student Lu Liu, along with other collaborators, including Li Giles, where we studied careers of artists, film directors, and scientists. And across all these kind of careers, we find, as different as they may seem, we find they all share a very common feature. That is, they are characterized by hot streaks, which are bursts of high impact works clustered together in close succession. So when we analyze the hot streaks and derive a model and fit it in the real careers, we start to learn some interesting properties about hot streaks, which may be interesting to all of you listening. First, we find hot streaks are actually rather ubiquitous. About 90% of people have at least one hot streak. But at the same time, it's also usually unique. Most people have just one hot streak, and people have 2 or 3 hot streaks are exceedingly rare. Next, we also find that hot streaks emerges randomly within the sequence of works one produces. Okay, so this is sort of to say, it can be with equal probability to be associated with your first work or last work or somewhere in the middle. And next, we also find that hot streaks don't last forever. It's temporarily localized, usually lasts about 4 to 5 years. And it does not appear to be associated with a productivity change. In other words, you don't really produce more than what we would expect you to otherwise. It's just what you produce here seems to be substantially a higher impact than anything else you produce in your career. So this notion of hot streak obviously are highly relevant in science and beyond, because the future impact is critical for hiring, career advancement, research support, or other decisions. For example, we find that the timing and magnitude of hot streaks dominate a researcher's career impact. As such, ignoring the existence of hot streaks and its singular nature may lead us to systematically over or underestimate the future impact of a career. But for a long time, since the publication of the paper, a central question remains open. That is, what's the mechanism? Why there is hot streak at the first place? This was the question I raised shortly after the publication of the first paper. To me, this is the central question because it could potentially help us answer a range of new questions. For example, can we anticipate the start or the end of a hot streak? Can we create an environment to facilitate an onset of hot streak and to extend it when it emerges? And for someone who has had a hot streak, can we treat it as an indication of that person's potential and help them realize the potential again? So we have been trying to understand, any potential mechanisms, regularities, or triggers for the beginning of hot streaks. But for about 3 years, we've tried about 20 different hypotheses and we went nowhere. But finally, after a couple of years, I'm very excited to share that there's some recent progress in this direction that I would like to share first today with all of you. And the epiphany started when before the COVID time, when I was visiting Amsterdam, I was walking around the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. And as I was walking around the museum, I knew that Van Gogh was a data point in my sample, because his hot streak started in 1888 when he moved from Paris to south of France. So, and I was walking around the museum, I feel like even for an art amateur like me, I could see some differences before and after 1888 as a time mark. So this prompted me to think about, with again, IST PhD student Lu Liu, is to think about, if we really want to understand hot streaks, we ought to figure out how the work itself look before and after house week begins. So this prompts us to collect a range of new data sets, trace the career outputs of artists, film directors, and scientists. In particular, we collected careers of about 2,000 different artists that covering 800,000 images of their artworks they produced and collected from museum and gallery collections. And we also studied about 4,000 different directors, analyzing about 80,000 plots and cast lists for associated with each movie. And we also studied about 20,000 scientists, analyzing over 1 million publication records with citation information for each of the scientists in our data set. Once we assemble all this data, you immediately realize, well, I can walk around the Van Gogh Museum in a day. 800,000 images is going to take me a couple of years, to say the least. So the question is, how do we do this? And this is where AI to the rescue, right? So to examine the art style of each artist, we realize we can actually repurpose the state-of-art image recognition algorithm and repurpose it, that deep neural network, to classify for art style labels. So in this case, we use a transfer learning approach to construct an embedding space, high dimensional embedding space for artworks. Specifically, we apply a pre-trained VGG net, which is one of the best known algorithms for image recognition, to images of artworks and connect it with an additional neural network of fully connected layers to classify the art style labels recorded in the data. So in this case, then the filters in the first layer is going to capture low-level features such as line orientations and brush strokes, and those at a high-level layers is going to combine the inputs from lower layers to capture more complex objects such as shapes and objects, right? So, so in this case, our approach is not just sort of predict art style labels. Is once we achieve about 97% accuracy, we start to open the hood of the deep neural network and start to analyze what exactly this neural network is seeing out of this painting. Similarly, for film directors, we combine plot information and cast information for each film, and we train first a word embedding in the description of plots and learn a 100-dimensional text representation of a film. We then incorporate cast information by constructing a weighted co-casting network and apply a node embedding method, a deep walk in this case, to obtain another 100-dimensional casting vector to represent each film. So this gives you a high-dimensional representation of what each film is about. For scientific careers, we did two methods. One method is we use the recently developed methods in the literature, which identifies research topics along a career by finding communities of a weighted co-citing network of all the references in each paper. And this helps us capture the dynamics of research topics as reflected in the publication history. Okay, once we build all this machinery, then we can test some hypotheses. The one prevailing hypothesis one we want to test is to think about the idea of exploration versus exploitation. Because of the myriad forces that may affect career progression, the strategies of exploration and exploitation have attracted enduring interests from a very broad side of a discipline, and some references to this here, for example. So this makes us wonder if there's any potential relationship with house weeks. So in this case, we can just line up every career when their house week begins, and then we look at just the works produced before house week and the work produced after the house week. So in this case, we look at the embedding place and then embedding space, and we apply clustering algorithm and group together the related styles and topics, okay? And then we look at auction prices, IMDb ratings, and citations to figure out where house week occurs. And then what we measure is before house week occurs, what's the entropy for the work they produce compared with, as well as measure it for the afterwards, and then compare with a null model in which if we expect house week to occur randomly. Okay, so across this careers, once we test this, the distribution of entropy for works produced before and after a house week emerges, we compare with the null model, and then we find actually just three simple findings. First, we find before a house week, we find entropy is systematically larger than expected. So this indicates individuals tend to diversify the topics they work on before a house week begins, consistent with an exploration strategy in the period leading up to house week. Second, following the onset of house week, we find that entropy measured in real careers becomes systematically lower than expected, suggesting that individuals become more focused on what they work on, better captured by exploitation strategy. Third, despite the differences in the three types of careers we study and the methodologies to examine their career outputs, we find this association between exploration, exploitation, and house weeks appears rather universal across all the three domains we studied. Okay. Interestingly, we find that neither exploration nor exploitation alone is associated with the house week dynamics. Rather, is this shift from exploration to exploitation closely traces the onset of house weeks. One plausible explanation of this is that exploration as a risky variance-enhancing strategy increases the chances that one stumbles upon a new groundbreaking ideas. And the subsequent exploitation that allows the individual to focus, develop knowledge and capabilities in that focal area, and build out their discoveries further. Importantly, our findings suggest that both ingredients of exploration and exploitation seem necessary. So this supports the notion that not all explorations are fruitful, and exploitation in the absence of great ideas may not be as productive. On the other hand, the sequence of exploration followed by exploitation may facilitate the emergence of high impact work by incorporating new insights into a focused agenda. So this positioning of exploration before exploitation may therefore serve to expand an individual's creative possibilities. Okay, so that's the first type of work and direction I wanted to share. But one problem with this line of work is to think about this actually is confronted by a major trend that has happening throughout science and technology. That is one of the most remarkable trends over the past century is that the growth of large teams across all areas of research as solitary researchers and small teams diminish. So this highlights a view of science today. It's not about individual geniuses making guiding contributions. Rather, the high impact advances and discoveries are disproportionately more likely to come from a complex network of innovators working together in larger teams. So this is what highlights the importance for us to understand teams and collaborations in science. So in one poster child of the celebration of achievement of large teams is the Ligo experiment, which was deemed as a discovery of the 21st century. It won the Nobel Prize within the 2 years of a discovery. And as a recovering physicist, people say I get a little too excited when I talk about this, but bear with me, I just explain what they did, right? So the team built this 2 arms of tunnel that's 4 kilometers long each, okay? And that's housed in this ultra high vacuum that's trying to detect with laser beams in between, that's trying to detect a variation that's a trillionth of an inch, okay? So obviously, this is a feat, that remarkable achievement by large teams. When the paper was published, it has more than 1,000 authors on it. And this is the feat that no small teams or individuals can ever hope to pull off, okay? So partly for this reason, this remarkable movement toward larger teams has become self-fulfilling. Research shows at NSF, when 2 teams are equally capable and promising, funders are more likely to fund the larger teams precisely built on this premise. At the same time, there are also reasons to believe that large teams may not be optimized for innovation. Large teams, just like large business organizations, may focus on sure bets with large potential markets, whereas small teams with more to gain and less to lose may undertake new untested opportunities. So this prompted me to test with my collaborators across a range of domains. A simple question is bigger always better? So we collected 3 kinds of domains. First is to think about 43 million papers, teams as reflected in publications from Web of Science. Second is about 5 million patents granted by USPTO. And third is about 16 million projects on GitHub in terms of software development. Across all these data sets, we want to measure a different quantity than has been commonly measured in the literature, in which we want to measure, this is called a disruption index. So the idea is, for a given work, we wanted to think about to what degree this work destabilizes this field by creating new questions, versus this is developing this field by just answering existing questions. Okay, so one way to do this is think about this measure. This is my focal paper. I want to look at, for all the papers that in the future cite this paper, how much this future paper also cite the references I cited. Okay, so if all this future paper only cite me, ignores everything that came before me, I would say this is a very disruptive paper. Okay, now for this example, if everybody in the future cite me and also cite everything came before me, then I'm really just amplifying the literature and answering a pre-existing question that was already there. Let me give you a real example. This is a BTW model paper, which opened up the new area of self-organized criticality. About 3,000 citations in total, so it's highly influential. But you see, when the new papers cite this paper, it largely ignores everything that came before. On the other hand, Davis et al. Paper, which has the similar number of citations and won Wolfgang the Nobel Prize in physics for empirical demonstration of Bose-Einstein condensation. But for this paper, although a Nobel Prize winning paper, when future papers cite this paper, they also cite what came before. So what we call this is a developmental paper. Okay, so we want to apply this index, which was developed not by us, by the way, it was developed by Jason Owen Smith at U Michigan and Russell Funk at Minnesota. So we want to apply this index and to the data sets we have. And so when we apply this index to the three domains we have, we find one nearly universal pattern, where namely, all these red lines are going up with team size and the green lines are going down. So what does this mean? When we look at red lines, we measure the citation impact of the work team produces. So we see as team gets larger, the impact of the work they produce systematically increases. So this is consistent and conforms all the prior literature on the subject, okay? But at the same time, we also see as team gets larger, the disruptiveness of their work systematically decline, which is shown as the green lines. So what this is telling us is that whereas large teams tended to develop and further existing ideas and designs, their smaller counterparts tended to disrupt current ways of thinking with new ideas, inventions, and opportunities. So in other words, large teams excel at solving problems, but it is small teams that are more likely to come up with new problems for them to solve. So this goes back to my LIGO example. While LIGO was the discovery of the 21st century, it was a careful demonstration of a prior hypothesis. Indeed, it was built to validate the discovery of the 20th century, proposed exactly 100 years before. In November 1915, when the Prussian Academy of Science first heard this highly disruptive theory of general relativity, it was presented by just one single author and the ultimate small team. So the idea of gravitational waves and their measurements both move science forward, but they do so in very different ways. Okay, so so what this is saying overall is to think about this central conclusion is both small and large teams are essential to a flourishing ecology of science and technology. While small teams can drive disruption and innovation, larger teams can pick up the ball and engage in the greater development of a given area as a part of forming, as a part of a virtuous cycle. So we're also very grateful that Nature put us on the cover, highlighting sort of this idea of an ecology of research of both small and large teams that help advance science frontiers, and they do so in very different ways. Okay, and overall, this idea also applies to business management and other practices. For example, in recent times, it's been easy to think, I manage the team in the daily basis. And for me, I want to be very collaborative. So it's easy to think that maybe, why not add another member to the team? Okay, so it may not help, but it shouldn't hurt, right? But our research shows that this is actually not true. Creating larger teams likely shift the focus and outcome from disruptive to developmental. So it really depends on what kind of project you're working on. For the most innovative projects that seek to disrupt a field, move the needle dramatically, one perhaps should consider how to shrink the team first before you even start. Okay, and I think this is also important as we're thinking about AI, which is a field that develops very, very quickly with larger teams on one hand, but at the same time, there's also a tremendous amount of opportunity to think about fundamentals and being very disruptive new ideas in the field. Okay, so now I want to sort of shift the gear to think about another direction. So I have two more directions I want to talk through. In the remaining time, I want to skim through this, but to highlight, these are what I consider a very recent new directions that will have a lot of potential. First, I want to think about sort of a challenge when I look at our work that we've been studying the successes of individuals, teams, companies, and the products they produce. And then I begin to realize there's a big elephant in the room that we have not paid enough attention, which is failures. Okay, so this is where I direct my research group in the past couple of years, is to think about how do we think about failures. And here I'm just going to give you two examples, but there's a more broader range of questions we've been investigating. But I'm also very happy to report that over the past few years, we have also learned a few things about failure. So I want to share with you one of them. In particular, I think our research on this domain has helped us improve our understanding of two major questions. First, are there impending signals in failures that eventually lead to success? Are there things we can learn from failures that can help us succeed sooner? What are they and how? Second, do failures matter? What's the consequence of an early failure on long-term career outcome? One of the early papers for the first question was published 2 years ago in 2019 by my PhD student, Yiyan Yin, who is, by the way, right now on the job market. And so today I'm going to focus on the second question, think about consequences of failures. And in this case, I want to sort of look at a failure that has fascinated me for as long as I can remember, which is near miss. Near miss is kind of the failure that you almost, but didn't quite make it, right? So, so the question is, if you had an early near miss, how much of a difference does it make as you go forward, right? So this may be particularly relevant for all the young people in the audience, because we're as a profession, we experience failures and near misses in the daily basis. All right, so the opportunity came when NIH came to me and offered all their data, which is a trove of failure and successes. So in this case, NIH is the largest funder for biomedical research in the world. In this case, we have access to 700,000 competing applications to the NIH and spans over 35 years. And what makes the NIH data quite unique is that the way NIH funds the project is every proposal goes through the peer review panel, and that's graded through a priority score. And then the program manager got that score back, just rank the proposals by their score and starting to fund the proposals one by one until a certain point they run out of money. So that's what's called pay line at NIH. This pay line creates a very interesting two sides of people that I'm really interested in, what I call narrow winners and near misses. Okay, so narrow winners now, just because of down luck above this arbitrary cutoff, that they now have $1 million for the next 5 years to do exactly the research they proposed they wanted to do. And near misses at the same time had nothing. Okay, and all the difference between the two is because one is the down luck being one side or the other side of the pay line. So this is what economists call identical twins. So I wanted to sort of, at this work, focus on specifically junior PIs whose first application were within 3 years of the treatment. So thinking about the junior PIs who start their lab within 3 years. So particular question I'm curious about is that I want to think about long-term thinking, let's not hang up on this little unfortunate event. Let's think about many years later, when these people come back for a job interview, who should you hire? Okay, so this is the question I want to ask. And this is a question that used to have a trivial answer. The answer is you should hire the one who succeeded, even though this, so the reasoning is even though these two groups of people were the same people a priori, but success begets success, rich get richer, and nothing succeed like success, right? So what we wanted to do is simply go to our data and think about, let's trace the publications for this two group of people over the next 10 years and see who did well, okay? So here I'm gonna use a measure, first a measurement that's ISO standard in the field, which is called a hit paper probability. So the idea is out of all the papers you publish, how many of them end up being a hit paper, which is top 5% citations in the same field and year. So the baseline rate is 5%. So you see that narrow winners in this case produce a hit papers about 13%, substantially higher than their contemporary scientists in their field. So this is to show that getting to be a narrow winner at NIH is not a walk in the park, right? I myself has never been to that close to NIH funding. So also these are really strong people. So if we repeat the same analysis for near misses, what we see is that they produce hit papers at 16%. Now, if we look at the next 5 years from year 6 to year 10, and look at the papers published then, you see a similar gap emerges, right? So what you see is that orange group systematically outperformed the blue group. But the key is this orange group actually the one who failed. So somehow paradoxically, they systematically outperformed narrow winners in the future. So when I first saw this, I was like, this can't be right. There must be something wrong. So the postdoc, Yang Wang, who's in my lab, basically did everything we can and tried every kind of variation, every measurement. And then basically every time we look at it, we see the same kind of patterns. Okay. And if you look at the number of papers they publish, you see the two groups publish roughly the same number of papers. So basically the current conclusion is to think about, near misses had fewer initial grants by construction, but somehow, some way, they ultimately published just as many papers and most surprisingly produced work that garnered substantially higher impact. So this obviously really is a question of what the heck is going on, right? So one prevailing hypothesis here is called a screening mechanism. So it goes something like this. Early career failure is actually of consequence. So when that happens, it differentially knocks out a different group of people. So there will be more people from near miss group left. So we can actually validate this. We can see actually every early career near miss is associated with about 10% attrition rate. And this almost gives NIH directors a heart attack. But it does validates our underlying question, which is, is this quit versus grit, right? So the idea is this just the fewer people left. So it's a better half of the population that are still here, or do these people actually become a better version of themselves, right? So how do we test this? It's too late to call these people and say, come back and, publish some papers. So let's see how you do. But one way we can do is what commonly used in economics literature is to think about this conservative estimate, where we start to remove people from the narrow win group that we remove, exposed that we know from the weakest performer first, so that we artificially adjust the attrition rate of that group. So the remaining group is at the best position to compete with the near miss group. So then when we compare the two groups, we see that, the narrow winners performance improved by construction, but that improvement is not sufficient to make up for the differences that we observe. So this offers among the first empirical evidence to validate Michen's classical phrase of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And hopefully this also helps us illustrate, there's tremendous amount of opportunity to actually look at failures, because if you actually systematically collect the data about failures and compare with success, maybe you will have some very interesting new conclusions. And so this hopefully illustrates what I consider is one very promising direction right now, is to try to collect more data, not just on the ones who succeeded, but the ones also who failed. Now, switch gear to my last topic I want to share, which is to take all the science of science outside of science and is realize science is a core part of human society. It interacts over almost every corner of human society. And research also show, science and innovation is the fundamental engine for growth and prosperity. So another promising direction, in my view, is so how to better understand how science interacts with broader side of the human society. I want to use one example, which is also a timely example in the COVID-19 pandemic, to give you a flavor of what kind of new data sets we now have. But at the same time, I also want to sort of illustrate why there's so much data nowadays around this direction. Okay, so in this case, I want to talk about COVID-19 and think about the co-evolution of policy and science during the pandemic. Okay, so overall, there is a general, long-standing concern about the potential disconnects between science and policy, where important scientific insights may be missed by policymakers and bad scientific advice may affect decision-making. So take, for example, Charles Percy Snow, the canonical book, Science and Government, which describes major breaches between science and policymaking in the British government during World War II. Snow vividly illustrates how policymakers can be ill-equipped to utilize science or distinguish good from bad science amidst high-stake decisions where research advances in that case actually would prove critical to saving lives and winning the war. In some ways, similar things were happening in the beginning of the pandemic, right? So so the COVID-19 pandemic, when it happened, presented a highly dynamic, uncertain, yet extraordinarily consequential policy environment around the globe. At the same time, researchers are producing evolving knowledge about the nature of the disease, evolving knowledge about the containment policy and social implications. So what we had was this rapidly evolving two frontiers at the same time. So the question is the policy development closely linked to the scientific understanding or largely separated from it? And does policy development engage high quality science? And third, what kind of institutions play the central role in connecting policy with science? So the opportunity really came in terms of thinking about this new data sets from Overton, which gives us global policy documents published by government agencies, think tanks, and intergovernmental organizations across about 114 different countries worldwide. At the same time, this data set also captures all policy documents that also about COVID, but also the policy documents that cited the scientific articles. So this allows us to connect to the scientific database to see what these papers are in science. Okay, so in this case, we have several key findings I want to walk you through. First, I'm going to work at this most simplest plot, which is temporal plot. On the right curve, I'm going to plot the share of COVID-19 policy documents out of all the policy documents, approximating the attention to COVID-19. On the right, the blue plot, I'm going to plot the total number of confirmed cases worldwide. And what you can see is a remarkable synchrony between these two curves. So the policy attention closely mirrors the case dynamics between these two cases. Okay. When I look at when the policy documents cite science, how recent is that scientific knowledge? What you see is that the COVID-19 policy frontier is deeply grounded in extremely recent scientific insights, showing that policy documents around the world are inhaling the latest scientific results. And we also see that the quality of the science that appears in these policy documents is extremely high. We see this along two dimensions. First, we see the science cited by this policy frontier is highly cited within science itself. So that means it's consistent with what scientists themselves think is valuable. Second, amidst growing concerns over the quality and abundance of preprint servers on COVID research, we see that peer-reviewed journals remain a key institution. In particular, we see that policy documents draw on the peer-reviewed science with far greater frequency than works yet to pass the peer review. Okay. The final analysis, we look at a policy citation network and color nodes based on the institutions they belong to. Blue nodes are IGOs, green nodes are individual governments, and the orange nodes are think tanks. What you see is that blue nodes are in the middle, and they are the largest. So what you are seeing is that, at the same time, we also add a black border to the nodes if it's grounded in the scientific frontier. So what you are seeing is that first, hubs in this network mostly have black borders, confirming that site science also see more policy use. Second, although government agencies, the green ones, actually produce the most COVID-19 policy documents, but they're the least likely to cite science, and their positions in this policy network are largely peripheral, sometimes even separated from the main cluster. By contrast, policies that are central to the network, and especially those grounded in science, are disproportionately produced by IGOs, especially by WHO. So it highlights the IGOs as a critical role and critical institution in hailing the latest scientific insights and propagate through the policy network. Okay, so this overall gives us the first time that we're able to perform quantitative large-scale analysis on policy and science and their interactions. Right. So together we show that policy documents in the COVID-19 pandemic substantially access recent peer-reviewed and high-impact science. Right. So this means policy documents appear neither isolated from science advances nor reliance on dubious science. So this is overall appears encouraging for scientific community as we all try very hard to advance new research with the hope that our work may matter. At the same time, we also see a notable heterogeneity in the use of science across policymaking institutions. So the tendency to cite science appears mostly concentrated within IGOs and much less so in national governments. So overall, this is sort of tell us, while science is breaking through and scientific results are being heard, but they're not being heard everywhere. So we know that in World War II, scientific advances helped determine the winning side. Looks like it's also the case for the COVID-19 pandemic. So the idea here is that making sure the right science prevails in policy can help us collectively reach the winning side. And this is an example using COVID-19 as a timely issue to illustrate now we can take science of science beyond science to look at how science's influence is being used across the hallways of governments across the world. But at the same time, we're also seeing a range of new applications around this wing in thinking about we can have old academic papers, but we can also systematically track how these academic papers are being used in the broader public domains, such as the hallways of governments in terms of policy documents, or the mainstream media in terms of how science is being consumed through the perceptions of the general public, as well as marketplace applications in terms of how science is being used across propelling the new technological advances, right? And this is sort of a downstream use. At the same time, we can also look at the upstream input to science, which is the fundings of science, which now also become available. So together, all this data set allow us to ask a range of fascinating questions. And so this is only one example today. For the interest of time, I won't be able to get into, but one of the questions we were asking is to think about to test the key idea of science as a public good. So the idea is that the science is a public good, just like a public park that needs to be supported from the public funders, from the taxpayer money, but then people can visit the park for free. The idea here is that because the nature of the science, it will actually quickly induce market failure. So this is the key institutional design of science. So just like the public park, we want to publicly fund science, and then the knowledge we generate everybody will be able to use for free. But this is the key idea that has not been able to test systematically until, if you think about the power of this data set, now we can actually show, in fact, the public use of science and the scientific use of science and the public funding of science show a remarkable consistency across these different dimensions. So sort of moving us beyond this idea of science is just an ivory tower capturing some peculiar interests of science, but it's just the opposite. In fact, what was produced in science is heavily used in public domains, and then this very consistent between the public use and public funding. Okay, so that's the end of my talk. I just want to leave you with this one single question that we raised roughly a couple of months ago in Nature Communications, where I had some new data sets to understand how COVID-19 has disrupted scientific work. And then one particular finding we find, it seems like people have been actually quite productive overall in terms of COVID-19. If you look at the papers, grant applications, and sort of collaborations, those seems to stay flat, if not increased. But the challenge we find is that it seems like we're really just busy of finishing existing projects. And in terms of new projects we're starting, we see a very dramatic global decline across the scientists that we surveyed. So the key question I think leave all of you with is to think about, as we grapple with COVID-19, as the pandemic goes on and on and on, the key question for us to all ask ourselves is how many new projects have you started this past year? All right, so hopefully that's helpful. Very grateful for a range of funders that support our research. Feel free to check out the center website as well as my personal website for more information. And I'll stop here, I think roughly on time, and then take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dashun, for that wonderful talk. Certainly learned a lot. We do have time for some questions. If anybody has any questions, they can either unmute themselves and ask a question directly, or they can type something in the chat. Questions, anybody?
Hi, I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
So you talk about the novelty of scientific work, and there has been some publications on mirroring that try to mirror the novelty of scientific work and study their trends over time, but they use different methods. What do you think is the best method to mirror the novelty of scientific work?
It is a very productive area to think about novelty, measure the novelty of a paper, novelty of a patent. And there's a couple of different attempts to do that. In doing that, one prominent one would be a colleague of mine right now at Kellogg, Brian Woodsey, and Ben Jones, with their collaborators, they proposed this novelty measure in 2013, as well as some other measures been doing along these directions. One clarification is that the work that I present today, is not specifically about novelty per se. Here, we're primarily interested in the disruptiveness of a work, so which is correlated with novelty, but it measures a different direction in this case, right? So here I'm more thinking about in terms of the reception. We infer from the reception of a work to see to what degree this work disrupts current way of thinking, or it develops existing school of thought. Yeah.
Great, thank you for that question. Does anybody have any other questions? While people are thinking questions, I have a follow-up question to Jihan's question. So according to the notion of disruptive index that you outlined, would survey papers be considered disruptive? Because they cite a lot of papers that already exist. And then I would imagine that there are several papers that only cite a survey paper and they don't cite anything, any original papers. So would have you excluded them? I mean, and that gets me to the bigger question is to what's happening? Why is it the case that, bigger teams are leading to less disruptive papers according to this notion of disruptive index, and smaller teams do lead to more disruptive work? What might be the causal factors underlying this phenomena?
I absolutely. There are actually, follow up on our work. I think, there's actually a recent paper from the Stanford Sociologists of Science group, it published in AJS in testing this, where they measured, it's a very interesting paper where they measured, what happens when there's a review paper. And what you see is that a review paper substantially, if it's good review paper, substantially reorient the field where new citations start to flow differently to the review paper. So in this case, it does show that review paper versus non-review paper may be just fundamentally different in their disruptiveness. We see this in several dimensions. First, we separate the analysis for review paper and non-review paper. we see the relationship holds within each sample. So it's not because it's just review paper that drive the relationship. We observe this in both cases. And this is where it's quite interesting. What we find is that even for review paper, if you look at the large team review paper versus small team review paper, you also see a big difference in terms of how developmental versus disruptive they are. Okay, and so in general, you can also ask other similar competing hypotheses to say, well, is this really just small versus large team, or could it be explained by other confounding factors? One idea is to think about, oh, it's not small and large team. It's really the differences in terms of disciplines or topics. For example, maybe small teams are more likely to attack certain disciplines or topics. Large teams are more likely to other disciplines and topics. So we can control for that when we see the relationship still holds. Or you can say, oh, it's more theoretical versus empirical. Small teams are more theoretical, and theoretical work more likely to be disruptive, right? And all these competing hypotheses. The most interesting one, I think, is the hypothesis that, well, you know what? The people are different. People who work in small teams are different from people who like to work from large teams. And these people that are ones that who drive this small, large team relationship. And we went down and tested this through a state-of-art author fixed effect model, and it took a long time to run the model. But after we run the model, what we find is that even within author differences, the same author that moved from small team to large team, you see that the disruptiveness of their work systematically declines. So this means it's not just authors, there's not just author differences, it's also within the same author, you will also see these differences as your team size increases, okay? So hopefully that sort of answers some of the questions. So what we're seeing is that this whole range of other factors account for a small portion of the overall relationship, but the majority of the relationship in our model is roughly 60% of the relationship does seem to lie within the team size itself.
I see. That's very interesting. I mean, it does answer my question, but it raises so many more questions as to what is it about large teams and what is it about small teams.
So then it goes to the social psych literature and small group literature, and then you'll see like it's actually fairly consistent with the small group literature, because the small group literature, in the micro side, has been traditionally focused on the penalty of large teams and the benefits of small teams. So, and they look at this through the difficulties in terms of communication, in terms of coordination, also in terms of retention, right? If you have a crazy idea, how do you get 1,000 people all go with you, right? If you 1,000 people all want to go with you, then it's a pretty obvious idea. It's gonna work, and it better be. So I think these are all the ways in which we can see why this finding may hold. And I think, because of diversity of domains that we look at, I think the answer is probably not one answer, is domain specific as well. So
very interesting. I think thank you, Dashun. Lee has
a question.
Yeah,
Hey, Dashun, how are you? Good to see you.
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm pretty good. It's not too bad these days. So my question is, again, big and small, but a different type of big and small. So science is sometimes broken into small science and big science. Yeah. And small science are the chemists, they all have their own little equipment that they buy. They don't share. They just because they feel the other chemist will destroy it or mess it up or whatever. And then there's big science, right, where you have a lot of people working on a project. So has there been any studies that try to and also in terms of big science, we're seeing, for example, only companies like Amazon and Google and Microsoft can actually do big deep learning projects. We can't because we don't have their resources. So you can think of them as big science too in some ways, because they have big resources. Yeah. So it's the big resources versus the small resources. So has there been any analysis of the impact of small versus big science in terms of, what's the most disruptive? Obviously, the deep learning tools that Microsoft and Google and Amazon have developed are very disruptive. and they couldn't have been done by, and they probably could have only been done by them. But
Sure.
is that true across the board, or is that?
Yeah, so we studied AI specifically in terms of sort of analyze what are the trends of AI. And, I do quite simple question is to think about, how many authors were in the original backprop paper versus, the a million parameters papers, in some ways is solving existing problems that will be highly influential and impactful, but, it's also quite developmental. So in that line, along that line, I don't see a difference. I see is playing out in front of our own eyes as the AI teams are growing larger and larger. And, that's, it seems like we're also not creating as much new directions, rather than we're just making the models bigger, more and more complex. So my bar is higher than your bar in the next Nearmiss papers, right? So, and I think, following your question on the small and large teams, small and large science, big science, I think the most recent paper that's, I will say, following the school of thought, it was a recent paper by James Evans and Yuhan Chu just a couple months ago in PNAS, where they show that when the field grows larger, you also see that canons being canonized, and the newcomers is hard to enter the field. So this is sort of extending this small and large team idea to the field. That's in my view. That's thinking about it. If your field is getting larger and larger, then your canons ossifies, and the newcomers are increasingly difficult to make a new idea to have a new idea that will disrupt the field. So I think that to me also is an important finding for thinking about AI. As you can see, the submission rates to AI conferences going off the roof in a way that I think has rarely happened throughout science, right? I'm yet to find another field that has expanded as dramatically as AI in the past few years.
So there was some evidence that something similar happened in security. So security papers were, in the beginning, there were a lot of security papers, and then no one cared about them, and then now everybody cares about it again. So it's sort of, there was an analysis of that. So it was a U-shaped curve.
Interesting. So security is recently going through a rapid expansion. I haven't followed.
Well, no, security went through a rapid expansion a little bit, quite a few years back, but okay. but I think in the, I can find that paper for you if you're interested, but it's not evident. I mean, it's not obvious that you see this too often where a field dies down. Also, AI died down too. You saw a lot of AI paper, AI had its winter, and the number of papers went down quite a bit. And then it started to move up again. And then deep learning now just blew, as you said, blew the roof off. So, and now you see deep learning papers everywhere, and not just, and surprisingly, not just in AI conferences. You see them in chemistry, you see them in material science, you see them in geothermal. I mean, you see them everywhere. So it's a technique that's moved outside of computer science.
Yeah, exactly. For sure. We actually have an ongoing paper to document exactly that in terms of the impact, estimate the impact of AI across the sciences. And that's what you see is like widespread, and also, including domains like humanities. And also what's interesting there is you see when these outside field actually uses AI, their papers are disproportionately to be the hit papers within their field, at the same time also attract more citations outside of their field, comparing with other papers in the field. So it does seem like, there are more and more papers using AI, and these papers are also generating a tremendous amount of impact, both within and outside their respective field.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Dashun. I guess we're out of time. If anybody has any quick follow-ups, please feel free to email Dashun. Let's thank Dashun for the wonderful seminar that he just gave. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to share with us your wonderful work. And we're very happy to welcome you back, even if virtually, back to IST. And we hope to welcome you back to IST and to Penn State sometime in person, hopefully when this ends. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Good to see everyone online.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. See ya.
Yeah, bye.